today I have the pleasure once again to talk to Kamalroop Singh. And this time we're going to be talking about Dasam Granth once again. However, we're going to be focused on the Sodhak Committee and then talking about some of the compositions that were not included in the final edition that they agreed on. So before we obviously go through that, I just want to start with getting to know a little bit more about what is the Sodhak Committee and when did this take place?
Okay, so that's a good question. And before we bite into the kind of the meat on the bone, so to speak, about this issue, there's a couple of other things that we need to look at. One is, firstly, why does a Panth need to standardize a non-standard manuscript? That's the first question I would ask. Because if you have a Sodhak committee, there's a need to mass produce and print and standardize a scripture that is non-standard. So I'm not being critical. I'm just asking an open question. Like, if you've got a manuscript tradition, why would that Panth or group of people need to move to the printing press when traditionally, just like the Jews who write, the Torah by hand, the Guru Granth Sahib was written by hand, and the Dasam Granth Sahib was written by hand, and Bani was written by hand. So that's the first question. So, and obviously the answer is there's industrialization and mass production. And so then we have to ask the next question, is industrialization of Bani part and mass production, is that really a part of Sikh ethics or Sikh tradition and Maryada? And I would answer it is not in any way, shape or form. So that I'm highly critical of it, and I'm just making it clear from the beginning. So people can look practically that the Gotge and the printed Dasam Granth Sahib is useful. And I agree with them to a certain degree, but you can see the amount of problems that's also created, hence why we're having this conversation, because it's problematic. Then the second thing is, in Guru's Maryada and in Gurmat, we follow parampara or traditions that have been passed down in the Khalsa Panth. And I'm not sure where committee features in that. Sodhak Committee. Committee is, where's this term from? Is it Sanskrit, Prakrit, Gurmukhi, Punjabi, Lendi, Urdu, Farsi? It's obvious, we all know what it is. It's English. Sodhak Committee, so we have a committee of people, so democratic vote on the orthography or spelling and structure of a scripture based upon a consensus vote of people and a tallying system of manuscripts. Just seems really stupid from the beginning. So that's my view on it, and I hope you understand my position there.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree. I think the historical context can definitely be questioned. Obviously, as you've also answered, there's a lot of reasons behind why those steps were taken. And I think one of the biggest things would probably be the influence of having to justify ourselves as a religion and standardize everything according to a alien Judeo-Christian framework, and therefore having to also not just point out an origin of time, a concept of God, and all these other things that I think we'd probably both agree on are the concepts probably aren't indigenous to the way we would say Sikhi is traditionally practiced. But just then digging into it on just its historical facts, when did this take place and who were the individuals that were involved? The only reason I ask is because then I wanted to try and figure out what like as you said, I know it's a committee, but what qualifications did they have to be able to decipher what is and what shouldn't be in a standardized recension?
Very good question. So, as far as I understand it, the Sodhak Committee got together around the end of the 19th century, and then they published a report in 1897, which is titled Report Sodhak Committee, Dasam Pasha, Sri Guru Granth Sahib Ji. And in there, they kind of go through their method of tallying the different sarups that are at their disposal, and a little bit about the Gyanis and the people who were involved in this endeavor. And the information are the same. It's kind of a bit like Punjabi eulogy and praise of certain people who are connected to, like, Gyan Singh's grandson or something like that, and a few other prominent Sikhs. But most people in this committee are quite obscure, and they haven't told us anything about their education levels or what they really know that would qualify them in this seva. And at the same time, does that really matter? Because we've just, I've made it really blunt and really quick for people to understand that it's a really stupid thing to do. And people are going to criticize me saying, who is he? Badaya, what does he know? But let's look at something basic that we learn at school. If you look at the periodic table, and I can't remember it for Adam, I can't remember it much now, but I know there's certain elements that are in certain columns that have properties that are not like the other elements in that column, but they have the right atomic number. Am I right in saying that? Yeah?
Yeah.
Now, if we look at that, if we apply that law of nature there, that there's anomalies to manuscripts that are not standard, to Bani that are extra, you don't throw out an element out of the periodic table just because it doesn't fit the properties of that column. In fact, you should know that it breaks the law of that column. And if you get an A grade in science, in an A level or a degree level, you'll have to know the exceptions to the rule, because that's what they're interested in, that you can remember those. Especially and even like in medical surgery, they want to see, can you remember the exceptions? That shows intelligence where there's anomalies in nature. But here you have this idea of standardizing a scripture, which in all in all the different types of manuscripts, there are different versions. So even logically, on if you use like this analogy of a periodic table, it doesn't make any sense. And then to have a committee to democratically oversee, so then it's a political activity because it's a committee. A political activity to oversee the tallying of manuscripts of its structure and orthography. It doesn't make any sense to me, it doesn't add up. And then I think it's exactly what you said, and you hit the nail right on the head. It is to legitimize our position as a Panth in front of Christianity and the printed Bible and its standardized form. And if you have that, if you look at this juxtaposition between the Panth and colonialism and what we were facing, you see that this whole endeavor was quite fruitless, because what it did is it created an issue amongst Sampradaya, amongst the Panth, about which Bani are legit and not legit, like even like 30 Savaiye becoming 32 Savaiye, and other, important bits of Bani being left out. And then people like Pandit Narayan Singh having to write Tikas with extra Baniya, and, Hajur Saab just lately creating another standard version, which isn't like the version made in 1897, and so on and so forth. You see the problem. And what gets left behind is Guru Gobind Singh's Bani. That's what gets left behind. So what's important in looking at especially the transmission of manuscripts is there are two kind of terms that are used in academia, stemma and lemata. So it's like almost like the family tree of manuscripts and which manuscript follows from which manuscript. That's the only way that you could produce an authentic copy of Dasam Granth Sahib. And then even in that, you have to choose in the family tree which one you consider to be legitimate. So what happened in the case of Dasam Granth Sahib is because they used the tallying system, the earlier version, which was copied more, became the predominant version. And the version which was copied less, which was written about 2 years later, was copied much less and became an obscure version, which has extra Baniya. And that's the outcome of the report, regardless of the people involved. And it just shows they had no method and they had no understanding. And quite recently, Baba Dayal Singh, Baba Avtar Singh's father, he went to Baba Galwan Singh at Hajur Sahib and practically begged him, look, please include Ugurdanti, Sukhmana Sahib, the other Baniya, into the new Dasam Granth you're going to print. And obviously, because they have a committee and tallying process, that was never going to happen. But you see, that's why we're stuck, because we're using models which we're too young as a group, as a community, as a panth, as this spiritual tradition to be worrying about having a standard text.
So just to clarify, one thing that you've mentioned is when you say a tallying system, do you literally mean they counted how many times something appeared in the selection of manuscripts they were looking at and was and were essentially like, this turns up the most, so this must be authentic, this turns up the least, therefore it's not?
That's all they did. And they even write that about certain manuscripts. They'll say, well, there is this one from Buddha Dal, which is really famous and it has got extra Baniya. Oh, but it's only one. And so therefore we must dismiss this. Oh, there is this other Bani, but, we can't really say it's Gurbani because of this difference in language. So they try to use all this kind of like Shastri interpretation, which you find in the Nirmala tradition, where a lot of the Baniya were questioned by, you could say, the enemies or the adversaries of the Nahangs. And so any Bani that were particular to the Nahangs from Dasam Granth, the enemies of the Nahangs, the Nirmali at that time, they wrote against them. So they wrote against Ugurdanti. They had their own vested interest too, because it talks about Nila Bana, they wear Bhagwa Bana, and et cetera. So there were political reasons also why this Bani was removed. And that group of people or group of Sikhs were very loyal to the Patiala house, the Maharaja, who was a loyal British loyalist.
Fair enough. I think that's kind of, in a nutshell, wrapped up just discussing the Sodhak Committee and kind of just getting through that on its own. Now, rather than focusing on the Baniya that are actually in the standardized composition, which we'll come to probably at a later date, I wanted to discuss some of the Baniya that are not included. So what you've referred to last time we spoke as the apocrypha Bani. So what I would like to do is with some of these is basically find out a little bit more about their history. So if there's any kind of Sakya or stories related to these in particular compositions, kind of their content and what their purpose is. So just a few that we had jotted down was, the first one was Sansar Sukhmana, and I think you just mentioned it just a minute ago as well. So just starting with that one then.
Sure. I think if you don't mind, before we go on to that, it's important just to look at their process a little bit.
Sure.
So, again, like I'm going to get to exactly your question, but I think it's really important that we go through this a little bit, that what happened. So it was the British appointed Arjan Singh who had the idea of checking the different versions of Dasam Granth about the orthography. And he was the one who said there's mistakes in the spelling. And then they did get some prominent Sikhs like Baba Smear Singh of Patna Sahib and the head Gyani of Darbar Sahib, Pailena Singh, involved in this. And so 32 saroops were taken in like a procession with, conches blown and the Chaur Sahibs and everything else and the puja done and Prakarma around Darbar Sahib. And there was a whole ceremony about this happening. And they used the second floor of the Akal Takht Sahib to create this new standard. And after they checked the different volumes against each other, they started in 1895, and I think they finished around 1897. And then the swaroop that they created was 1428 ang or pages, which is symbolically 2 angs less than Sri Guru Granth Sahib Maharaj. And their report is just about 30 pages. I mean, how can you have a 30-page report over something so large and voluminous? You can't, It was really going to hundreds of pages, really, that they needed to report. And they didn't. And, the first thing is they say, Guruship was given to Guru Granth Sahib Maharaj. That's not questioned. They said Akal Ustat and Jap Sahib are to be repeated. And that Bachitra Natak was written to make sure that people just worship Akal. The Durga stories were written to give viras to people. Gyan Prabodh about kingly rights. Jobi Avtar to talk about Ravan and the Hindu pantheon. But you see here, that's disguising what we discussed in the last podcast, which is written for purposes of viras.
Yeah.
And again, this is not discussed and so, Brahma Avatar, Rudra Avatar, again, is for Biras. And then they talk about, against sort of mindless rituals like Shabazare, Teti Savaye. And then they do go a bit towards Biras, like Shastra Namala, to increase the knowledge and use of weapons. And Charitra Upakyan, political stratagems, didactic tales and stuff. So there's some good things that they've written. And the plight of, drug use. And, the Zafarnama, Hikayata, to Aurangzeb, and then they mentioned the Asfortic Kabit, but that was removed from the standard, right? So they mention a Bani in their discussion of Dasam Granth, which they removed. And they talk about Shastra Vidya, ironically, when they talk about Asfortic Kabit Savaye. And then they talk a little bit about the history of Sri Dasam Granth, that Jab Sahib and Akal Ustat were written in Anandpur Sahib, Bachitra Natak, Chandi Charitra, Ukta Balas, Chandi Diwar, Gyan Prabodh written at Anandpur Sahib. Jobi Avatar was written, completed at the Satudra River, Krishna Avatar of Ponta Sahib, Yamuna River, many parts of Krishna Avatar written there, and Charitra Pakyan written, the Satudra River where the Gurdwara Papur Sahib is, and Zafarnama at Dina, and the Hikayatan, the Battle of Bangani. So they do give some really important historical information there that we must acknowledge. And then they go through like the Anandpuri Saroop, which had Hukamname, Gurinder Singh Man of Santa Barbara. He gives some photos of this in the Journal of Punjab Studies. And, it has like a court poet, like not court poet, court scribe writing in there, and the Guru's signatures. And and how they think that kind of that Saroop was put together, the Mangalacharans, how the Bani begins. And then and it's funny that they call the Dasam Granth within this report, Sri Guru Granth Sahib. Very interesting. Very interesting. So these points we need to really discuss. And they talk about the Nahang Singhs, like I mentioned earlier before, and then they even talk about where different Bani was read. So obviously the Swaye, Jap Sahib, Chope Sahib for Amrit, the Sera Ram Avatar, Navratniya, Chandi Charitra at the Taks, Hola Mahalla, the Krishna Avatar, And they're even talking about that, this Bani being read at Darbar Sahib and Akal Takht Sahib. And so this tells us a lot about the praxis of the time. And then now we get to the actual excision of the Apocrypha, which was your question, but it's important to set that backdrop.
Just a quick question before we go into that, and thank you for all this information, because it really does help. But one question that I have, and I'm sure other people are thinking the same thing, which is, if the Sodhak Committee turned up and standardized and therefore, for want of better words, legitimized the composition that they agreed on, why then was Dasam Granth not accepted within the Singh Sabha mainstream Panth, so to speak, considering they had literally had a committee to agree on what is and what isn't within the composition?
The answer to that is complicated and simple at the same time. So the simple answer is the Singh Sabha had the Lahore faction and the Amritsar faction. So the Lahore faction was under Atta Singh Bahadur. He was British loyalist, again with the Patiala royals related to the Maharaja. And so they had their own Protestant interpretation. So your Teja Singh Pasauriyas and these types came out of this group. And your anti-Arthi, Gyani Dit Singhs and others were part of that group. And then the other group, which labeled themselves only because of the other group, they called themselves Sanatan, and they meant they're traditional. And that group readily accepted the Dasam Granth, where the other group didn't. So that created the schism. And again, it's divide and rule, because as soon as you create this standard, you bring it into public eye, you bring it into public discussion, and then obviously it's going to be schismatic, and that's the whole idea behind it. And isn't it interesting? Now look, isn't it interesting? Any Bani that mentions Khalsa explicitly is removed. Isn't that interesting? Sarag, Surat, Asa that talks about Kakar, Kesh, removed. Ugurdanti, very Biras, removed. And so on and so forth. So any Bani which is literally telling you, giving us Guru Gobind Singh's words about his Khalsa are removed. So for me, by removing those Baniya, you take away the context of Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, which is the Taram Yudh, that the Khalsa must take on that role of Taram Yudh. So you must have the Khalsa mentioned there. And that's the Bani that's excised. And they're the same Baniya that the Nirmali didn't like, who are not Shastrtari, who are not armed. So you see there's a thread here, isn't there, of disarming, changing a worldview, changing the context of a scripture. Very clever how it was all done. Very clever. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask, just off what you were saying, would it be fair then to say that without the Apocrypha Bani, there's automatically a piece missing? There's automatically, because from what we've been talking about, it almost sounds like Dasam Granth is a massive jigsaw puzzle, and all of these different manuscripts with different Baniya, some with certain compositions that aren't in others. But by excising quite a substantial amount of them, it's almost removed a key piece, because from what, the impression that I get is that there was a remodeling of the Sikh identity through obviously various means, but in this situation, we're obviously talking about removing certain compositions, which from what you've indicated relate directly to Nilabana or Shastra or Kes or certain things that those who were in the committee or part of the Lahore Singh Sabha, I think, would be almost not scared of, but they're almost they're concepts that they're not willing to obviously deal with.
Exactly, and exactly, and we can see this where in their own comments, Gyani Shardul Singh, who wrote the report, he says in in one of his comments about which bits are excluded, that essentially the Devi Geeta Chaka, or, the Chakke of Nama Ugurdanti Nanti Svaya. He's saying, well, that's a description of the Singhs themselves, but this is not from the Guru. And it's an Ardas. And it's not anywhere else in Dasam Granth, but this Bani is well known. And you find the same argument that he puts forward by Tara Singh Narotam in Siri Gurmat Nirnay Sagar, 1877. So from an earlier text. And obviously he was a Nirmala. And then you also have this same argument used by Khan Singh Nabha in Hum Hindu Nahi. So there's a connection there, and you can see his entry in Mahan Kosh as well under Shaka for Ugurdanti. So they excise this Bani where Khalsa is mentioned, saying, well, it's the Khalsa talking about itself. Well, there's no indication of that at all. And they use really meager kind of language like that hum and tum. And hum, like humri karo haath racha. And in Ugurdanti, the word tum is used. So they're saying the Guru couldn't have used tum. So that's their logic. I mean, it's pathetic, really, to be honest. And even today, you have so-called heads of big Sikh institutions, and I don't want any vitriolic from anyone, but you even had controversy about Ugurdanti just lately, whether it is a Bani or not. So they haven't seen the manuscripts. It's in old manuscripts of Dasam Granth. It's in breviaries. It's in Das Granthis.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm sure in some of the pre-colonial texts that, I can't remember which one. I don't know if it's good. I don't think it's Gur Soba. It might have been Sarup Das Bala's text. Yeah, that's it. And it's mentioned. So I'm kind of like, even when I'm reading this stuff, I'm kind of like, well, if there is reference to it prior to you brethren turning up, surely there's some type of historical evidence there to...
Well, exactly. Well, Gur Balas is dictated by Bani Singh Shaheed. And so the same people who are saying that they're from a lineage of Bani Singh are saying it's not Bani. Now, how does that work? Because Gur Balas was dictated by the famous Shaheed Singh Bani Singh. So, there's all these contradictions here. And for me, I'm going to go by manuscript evidence and what's there. And so the earliest version of Ugurdanti that I saw was in the Patana Sarup, which is obviously a very early Sarup, which it fits into the life of Guru Gobind Singh in terms of his Sammat, in terms of his Vikrami date. And, I mean, it's and then you've got Sukhmana Saab, the same, Var Malkonski as well. And they even write that, there was a manuscript, Babatal Rai Saab, which has these famous frescoes, which again have been whitewashed now. And there were soups there with these Bani in. And then they say something which is contradictory. He says, this Bani was written by the 10th Guru to infuse honor and courage to fight against the invaders. But many bees were destroyed. And a caste bead, which was written which had handwritten pages of Guru Gobind Singh, is not available to us. And they're saying in the bead of the Buddha Dal of Bani Singh, there were these extra Baniya. And they're saying these copies are rare. So then he contradicts exactly what he said earlier on. So he's saying there is historical evidence that Sarups from Guru Gobind Singh's time that were hand signed by Guru Gobind Singh with a dastkhat, which in Persian means a signature page, had those Baniya in, but because we don't have access to those Sarups, because we're using a tally system, we've had to remove those Baniya.
And so it's like you were saying in the last podcast, they're using a pickaxe to open a phone. It's the wrong tools, and you're looking at it from the wrong worldview. Just out of curiosity, one question then: what recension do the Buddha Dal use, and what recension are most people able to get their hands on then at the moment? So I'm assuming the standardized version is the version that like most Gurdwara will be using.
Exactly. Even the Buddha Dal now, they will rely more on printed Sarups, and they have the additional Bani that they recite in their daily liturgy. for their individual Nityanem. But if Buddha Dal has the authenticity that it claims, surely the Swarups that they read Gurbani from should include the Baniya that are important for the order of Buddha Dal and the Khalsa.
Yeah, well, hence the question. Yeah, I was a bit. My curiosity was getting the better of me.
Yeah, so I mean, when I was doing my research and I was on my field trips back in, I think it's 2002, 2003, 4, 5, and over these years, I kind of stayed about 4 years in Punjab, and I remember going to Hariyan Birla, Baba Nahal Singh's Dal, you can say he's the head Jathedar of it. And I went to the Gurdwara Shahidi Bagh and Sri Anandpur Sahib near Anandgarh Killa. And then I did Darshan of the Swarup, and it was the Sodhak Committee Swarup from 1897, Prakash there. And that made me interested. I looked through and I thought, well, where's Ugurdanti? Where's these extra Baniya that Nahangs really believe in? And you got to look at something like Var Malkonski. It's a Var like Chandi Var, and it's in Malkons. It's in one of the most beautiful rags, So there's something, a big gem of Guru Gobind Singh's Bani, and it's very prophetic Bani. Harju Harmandir avenge, this divine being will come back to the Harmandir. It's very prophetic. It's very apocalyptic. A lot of those Bani are very apocalyptic. They have this very dark edge about this kind of the world being destroyed and a new world forming after the destruction of an old world. So they're very prophetic with a lot of these lines about the Nila Kora, and then blood coming up to the mules like legs or the horses' legs. And we hear all this in Sikh prophecy, and we've heard this from Sants and Mahatma, and they've got it from these Baniya that were Guru Gobind Singh had recited in Biras.
I was just going to say that. I was like, so much of what you've just said, I've heard in snippets. And a lot of this also turns up in this in Godly's Sikh Prophecies book, which is, if you read it without the context, it doesn't make, like if you read it on its own, it doesn't make sense. But with the context that you're providing, it will make more sense.
100%. And this is what I'm trying to share in a clear fashion. Like, for me, the characters involved in the process are not important. What's important is the outcome, because that's what shaped the praxis and our approach and our rituals currently and our liturgy. And that liturgy has been changed to change our worldview. Of course, people who don't want the Khalsa to succeed, they don't want us to read Ugurdanti. It's full of Biras. It's one of the most Birasi Bani, full of power, it's full of fire. It just ignites the spirit in you. It's like you could be having a bad day and you read that Bani and you feel you could take on the whole world. Of course, they don't want you to read that. Of course, it makes complete sense why they want to take it out. And the same thing is like, if you look at the debate about Ragmala, if you look at Guru Granth Sahib's Bani, the people against Ragmala make a valid point. They say the ras of Ragmala doesn't fit in with Guru Granth Sahib. And they're right, because Guru Granth Sahib's Bani is very thandi, it's very shant, it's very empty, it's very seetal. And then Ragmala is like a party at the end of Guru Granth Sahib. But what they don't understand is that party at the end of Guru Granth Sahib, or the bhog, or the pleasure, or this enjoyment, or this different ras, is to anchor that shanti within the world. And in the same way, a composition like Sansar Sukhmana, which is pure shanti, is there to anchor the biras of Sri Dasam Granth, just as Shabad Hazare is in there and the Hekaita, and at the end of Dasam Granth, that shant it gives. It gives a seetal kind of ras that anchors all that biras. So people unfortunately, they haven't looked at ras and Indian literature and poetry and the types of, alankars and the type of shand and the type of kind of feelings that any poet, Guru Gobind Singh, Kabir Bach, he calls himself the poet. He's so humble because he was in the Symposium of Poets. So he's using that ras system of India. And therefore, it's something which is so birasi. You must have that seetal, you must have the shanti. So for me, all these extra baniya are very, very important that they're read, and that one day, hopefully, somebody with guts, and it ain't going to be me, I'll just tell you that now, comes forward and makes that claim, look, we need to have a Dasam Granth with all the Baniya, and they're going to have to fight the whole system and all the sants and all the people, ignorance out there, and hopefully we'll have a Swarup that is based on the edition from 1698 rather than the edition from 1696.
Fair. I couldn't disagree with any of that. I think the only reason I asked about the people involved is because it helps to then figure out why certain decisions were made. As in, like, so for argument's sake, you've highlighted some of their allegiances and leanings, and I think it then makes more sense as to why a certain theme of Bani were removed, or a certain number of Bani. I guess also the fact that using a tally system doesn't help, but they're
they were loyalists. They were using a new system that they thought would be beneficial, and obviously not. And obviously they're using a new system. They couldn't see the kind of negative aspects of that system. And like we said, they're loyalists. They're appointed by the British. It's managed by the British. And, printing, obviously where they're going to get the printing presses from. Just have to think about all of it and look at it in a wider view, on a macro level rather than a microscopic level. And the other point is, who do they have from the Sampradaya there? Nobody. This should already have alarm bells. There's no head of the Buddha-dal there. There's no head of the Seva Panthis there. I mean, they talk, I think they mentioned Baba Sham Singh, and they mentioned some, but there's no head, there's no authority, they haven't said here, all the Khalsas got together from all the Takhts, or, the whole Panth has got together to do this. There's none of that. They've just done this in Amritsar, and they've based it on the Swarups that are available to them within Amritsar Sahib. And that's all they've done. And I don't know, for some reason, they succeeded, and the version that they created, and I haven't, obviously it's Guru's Bani, and I'm mattha dek it, and I would bow my head to it, and I'm not saying it's evil or bad. I'm not saying that, or I'm just saying it's simply incomplete because of the method that they use. That's all I'm saying. And I know that will probably annoy people, but I'm not a liar. I can only tell people what I found in my research. And it's also important to note here that, where it comes, where we have these issues about what we can call apocrypha. We must look at this from a level of Sikh literature and theology. So you already touched upon the fact that what we say is apocryphal or extra to Dasam Granth, which obviously isn't the truth in the case of manuscripts, is present within manuscripts, because apocrypha would mean that it's not even present really in manuscripts, but it is. So when I say apocrypha, I say inverted commas. And so this extra Bani isn't really extra because it's mentioned in Sikh history throughout the 18th century. It's in manuscripts in the 17th century. It's in smaller pothiyan. It's in larger pothiyan. It's mentioned by scholars, which we've discussed. So really, there isn't a debate, but the debate has been created about them by this tallying system. And actually that debate, where I want to take it to is, where does this debate begin? And it begins with Tara Singh Narotam, whose guru was killed by Baba Prahlada Singh, head of Buddha-dal, who killed the Nirmala Mahant, who had forcibly taken control of Sachkhand Huzur Sahib. At Huzur Sahib, they're both shaheed. They did a kind of a sanjavar where they both killed each other pretty much in the same blow. One died a few hours after the other, but they both died, both shaheed, and both commemorated there. And because his guru, his Vidya guru, was slain by the head of the Buddha-dal, obviously he had his reasons why he was against all of this, including the Ugurdanti, because it has that fiery spirit, which is rebellious and out of control. And that's how the Nihangs are mentioned by the British all the way through history. Is like, these guys, they don't care. They're just not afraid of anything. They don't care about Maharaja Ranjit Singh. They attack him. They attack whoever they feel like, whenever they feel like. if they feel that they have a reason. They're rebellious. They march all over pretty much North India, wherever they want to go. We have to control them. And you can see that spirit is in the Baniya that they want to remove. And to support his arguments, the Nirmala scholar Narottam, he uses kind of grammar, and the main thing is about, he says the Guru never used the word Tuman. He uses Hamne or Haman or Hamri. And so then this couldn't be written by the Guru. And to base it on one word again is silly. And he also brings up Shia Islamic prophecies. He's saying that these compositions are based on, because in Sukhmana you also have a bit about Islam comes. In Varmalkons you have this kind of like Ismaili Mehdi prophecy type thing. But he says this, so it can't be written by the Guru. But then is he saying Nekalank Avatar isn't Bani? Because at the end of there, Mir Mehdi is killed. Sorry, Nekalank is killed by Mir Mehdi, and Mir Mehdi dies by insect crawling into his ear. So is he saying that isn't Bani? So his kind of argument is really about what we classify as Kari Bolli and Tadpav Sanskrit. So Tadpav is the classical form, and because he was a classicist, he found it distasteful. But Chandi Divar is Kari Bolli, as in his Punjabi, is rustic, everyday speech in a village. If you look at Sarblo Granth, is also not the power of Sanskrit like the Sanskritized bridge Pasha of Dasam Granth. It's a completely different dialect. And if he'd actually known about poetry in India, which he probably didn't bother to look because he's a classicist and poetry is considered lower, he would have known that if you were an accomplished poet, you would write in everyday language, you would write in the Sanskritized bridge Pasha to be an accomplished poet in the symposium of poets. So we all know geeks and people who are obsessed by a certain type of knowledge, but they can't see a bigger picture. That's Narottam basically. But you have to give him credit. Gurtira Sangre, he mentions Hemkund Sahib. He mentions like a lot of the relics of the gurus. He created big lexicons of Gurmukhi. He was a great Mahapurkh and a great scholar, but he hated the Nahangs. That's the bottom line. So I'm not against him. I'm just trying to give light about what happened in Patiala. And, he was Gyani Gyan Singh's guru. And Gyani Gyan Singh mentions that Ugurdanti is Maharaj's Bani in Pant Prakash. So he goes against his own Gurudev. So, Narottam wasn't accepted. And when for my field work, I had to go to a lot of places. I'm not saying to people or you or listeners, hey, I know everything. I know sweet FA. I'm just telling you whatever I found out to share with the Sangat and share it with people who are interested. But I did go to Kankal, where Hardwar, where the Nirmale are based, their biggest headquarters. What Tara Singh Narottam wrote, and he's the one who gave me a lot of the works of Tara Singh Narottam Pandit. He said, they're not accepted. Every word is not accepted by the Nirmale. We accept Sarvalo Granth as Guru Gobind Singh's work. We accept Ugurdanti as Guru Gobind Singh's work. He wrote these things in our name, but it doesn't mean we accept it as a sampradaya. So Gyani Gyan Singh didn't accept his position either. And I valued Mithil Prakar Singh, sadly isn't with us anymore, but I valued his position for the Nirmala Panchayat Akhada and how they stood for the Bani of Guru Gobind Singh. So there's a lot of things in colonialism that crept in. And again, what through the printing press. So you have to say who were the patrons of Pandit Tara Singh Narottam. It was the kings of Patiala who were British loyalists. He had his own reason to be against the Nahangs. And I'm not sure if in the last podcast, but I might mention it, but the Maharaja Patiala tried to create the Nirmala Buddha Dal. So that they tried to get the Nirmale to fight against the Nahangs to make a merger between both Sampradaya, where the Nirmala idea would be the higher order of the Nahangs. So reverse it on his head, where before the Nirmale would come to the Nahangs to get their Nishan Sahibs and their Nagare, their battle drum and their battle standard to be blessed, to get the permission to do their seva. And you can see in a way the Singh Sabha is later on a way of amalgamating different worldviews. And the Sikh Rayat Maryada is a way that they finally succeed. Again, another committee to tally. And now we've got the Shiromani Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee.
Interesting. Very interesting. And as always, thank you for sharing the context, because it definitely does help. I think the point you raised about the term apocrypha is probably the most important thing that I think you've mentioned. And I think it's probably worse than actually changing the term and actually saying the compositions that were almost excommunicated, because in an essence, that's what this committee did. They decided this is no longer technically part of what the Panth should be doing, and it's a sad state of affairs. I think calling it apocrypha Bani, as you said, paints the false image, because they're not apocrypha, as in that doesn't match the definition of that term.
Of course not, because look, I've got to state the obvious for people listening to this who didn't listen to the first podcast. You have a Swaroop at Sri Patna Sahib and copies of it from around the same period, from 1698, which one Swaroop has got Guru Gobind Singh's signature pages in it with these Vadu Baniya in it. And we know of other Swaroops, like Baba Deep Singh Swaroop had Ugurdanti in it, which is mentioned by Pyara Singh Paddam, who was a great scholar of Sri Dasam Granth Sahib in Dasam Granth Darshan. So you have a lot of books where where scholars of Dasam Granth, like Randir Singh, research scholar for the SGPC, and other scholars like Dr. Talochan Singh have mentioned these extra Baniya in important historical Swaroops. So if these extra Baniya are in extant Swaroops, then, like you said, we can't say they're apocryphal. And some of those Swaroops even exist now. And the ones that we've lost, like in 1984 and other periods, we've got the details lists of what Baniya luckily were in those Swaroops. So we've got a historical record of what was in those Swaroops. And I think now, Amar Singh, if you don't mind, that it's important to mention what Baniya were removed.
Yeah, sure.
And so you got Ugurdanti Sahib, Sansar Sukhmana Sahib, Var Pagoti Juki, Var Malkonski, Indra Kavach, Asa and Surat. You got Pagoti Stoter. You got Maj, which is like Lucky Jungle Khalsa Shabad, which is really famous. And there's Forta Kabitsvaye. And on that, you got like sometimes the Nishani Sikhi, Panch Haraf Kaf, about the Panch Kakar. And if you think about that, the Hikayat are written in Persian, Zafarnama is written in Persian, and in this Swaroop in Sangrur that a lot of scholars saw, on an extra folio, you had this Persian composition about the Panchakakar. And that's always sung in Amrit from Amrit Kirtan about the Panchakakar. And that Shabad is only in the version of Dasam Granth Sahib by Pandit Narayan Singh, another Nirmala. So why is he included it in there? Because you see, it's a Khalsa worldview of Panchakakar. And so we can't just brush these things aside. And then there's other kind of issues like, for instance, the Patna Sahib's group has Gobind Geeta. So it has the Bhagavad Gita exegesis by Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj. Now people say, well, that should be in Dasam Granth. No, it shouldn't be in Dasam Granth, and I'll explain why it shouldn't be. Then people also talk about Hanuman Natak as well. And I have these questions actually up 3 or 4 times a year. People will message me, email me about Sri Dasam Granth Sahib. And they'll say, well, why isn't Hanuman Natak in there? Why isn't Gobind Geeta? And then I have to explain, and it's worth me explaining here why that is. Because when Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj had his symposium of the poets, Sufi literature, Puranic literature, Vedic literature, Ayurvedic literature, palmistry, medicine, even a lot of sexual texts like the Kork Shastra, Kama Sutra, all of these texts were written into Gurmukhi. And for Vidya, for the benefit of the Sangat. And you're talking on like every type of subject, like horse medicine, from like, you know, diseases, farming, everything you can imagine was written on. And, you know, this huge Granth called Vidyasagar was written. And that actually still exists. People don't realize it still exists. And there are actually 2 copies of it, according to my research. And both of them were signed by Guru Gobind Singh. And because Guru Gobind Singh went through each page to read. And that's what separated Guru Gobind Singh's Bani from Vidyasagar, was because his Dasam Granth is his Bani in that symposium of poets. It was kept separate because obviously it's the Guru's work. And what's really interesting is Gobind Geeta features in the Mahabharata translation by the Kavis that the Guru had asked them to do to translate the Mahabharata into Brij Bhasha in Gurumukhi. And then the Kavis turned to Guru Gobind Singh and said, you know, this conversation between Krishna and Arjun, we're not worthy to translate this. Badshah, can you please translate it? And you find Gobind Geeta by Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj in that place. Then obviously what's happened is when these manuscripts were put together, there's this idea of authorship. So like Sekh knew who'd read all this material that actually, yeah, Guru Gobind Singh has authored this. This should be in Dasam Granth. But you see, Guru Gobind Singh hadn't included that as a part of his own work. He'd included that chapter as the work of the Kavis. So it shouldn't be in Dasam Granth. And also Hanuman Natak, it's worth going into the story about this, but Bhai Gurdas Palla, who wrote the Vara and Kabit Savaiye, remember the Kabit Savaiye are pretty much in the same language as Dasam Granth Sahib. And, you know, there's so many famous shabads from the Kabit Savaiye, and it's hardly read compared to the Vara, which are in Punjabi, and the Kabit are like in Hindi, the Brij Bhasha, the classical Brij Bhasha. And people don't read those, they don't connect to them. And so we need to connect to that Bani of the Kabit Savaiye, Bhai Gurdas. And his ancestor was Hirdaram Palla. And he was a court poet of Jahangir. And there was something happened in the court, some intrigue. And Jahangir imprisoned him in a cell of mirrors where he went blind. But he was a big Bhagat and he used to do Bhagati of Hanuman. And Hanuman, they say, appeared and gave him some palm leaves. And somehow or another, he had memorized a really old text about Hanuman. And so he wrote the Hanuman Natak on these leaves. And some Kavi or somebody had a lot of tars and they took these leaves to some mantri in the court of Jahangir. And they said, wow, this is arouses so much biras. It's got so much passion in it. It makes like somebody who's got no courage have courage. And the Hanuman Natak is mentioned in the Sodhak Committee report that one singer done thousands of part, and it says part of it. No one reads the Hanuman Natak now. When I went to Baba Santa Singh with Ram Singh, who's no longer a Singh anymore, he might be, might not be, but he used to be a Mahakal. Baba Santa Singh always used to say to us, if you want to understand Sri Dasam Granth Sahib, you have to understand Hanuman Natak. And why is that? Is Baba Santa Singh a Sanatanist and he's just saying it because he's a proper Hindu with a tilak on his forehead because he's a Brahmin? I'm taking the mickey. Of course not. Because Guru Gobind Singh references Hanuman Natak himself in his own work. He says, if you want to know more about this story of Ram Avatar, go and read the Natak, e.g. Hanuman Natak. How can you not listen to the words of Guru Gobind Singh? And, you know, even Khan Singh Nabha prizes this story of Hanuman Natak. Is one of he did his own exegesis for the Maharaja Patiala's son of this work. It's considered so important. And what happened was that the original Sanskrit of this, the king of Bhoj, Hanuman had written this into stone according to the mythology, and he'd carved it with his nails into stone to talk about the story of what happened in the Ramayana from his eyes. And then he thought, no one should, my word shouldn't be higher than Ram's. So he pushed all the rocks he'd carved it on into the sea. And this Maharaja heard about this. So he sent divers into that ocean and they made wax impressions of it. Then this Sanskrit text is what Hirdaram Palla had memorized. And that was what was written into Bridge. And it was by Nandlal, who gave that work to Sri Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj. And Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj, what did he say? He said, even a coward who reads this will become brave. And that's why it is not read today. And we've become a panth of Fosser who are bloody shit scared of even a mucky landing on our nose. And that's why we've lost all our traditions. I even said to somebody who's really famous in the panth, Nahang Singya Sharamali Galya, I said, when are you going to do Hanuman Natak's Prachar? He goes, too controversial, I can't do it. This is a full-fledged, famous Gyani with Maya coming out of his ear holes, who is a Nahang Singh. He's got one of the biggest followings. And he said, I can't talk about Hanuman Natak, it's too controversial. Then what do you talk about? If Guru Gobind Singh, Khan Singh Nabba, who's a Singh Sabha scholar, says Guru Gobind Singh kept the Poti of Hanuman Natak in his Kamar Kasa. He prized that book that much. Guru Maharaj prized that book so much. We should be ashamed of ourselves because we've lost our literature and we've become so feeble. And you know what? In the way that those Vaddu Bani, I say Vaddu Bani, I need to be careful. Just as those powerful Bani were excised out of Dasam Granth Sahib, loads of other things have been excised out of the Sikh tradition. And we should be ashamed of ourselves. And we need to bring this part. I'll be the happiest Banda ever, like people doing Brahm Kavach now. I remember years ago when we started this and people told us not to do it. Now it's everywhere. I'm really, really happy. And the part of all these other Bani, I'm really happy. I'll be the happiest Banda if in a few years I look on the internet and I'll see people doing the part of Hanuman Natak and doing the exegesis from it and bringing it out. Because I want our Panth to be brave. Because we're not going to get anywhere in the world being weak. And if Guru Gobind Singh prized this book so highly that Dasam Granth's meters and measures in terms of its poetry are literally got the same essence of it, have got the same structures of verse and poetic style as it, then you know what? I have to bow to that Buddhi as well. And I hope that people start reading it and people can call me a Sanatan instant and say, oh, he's going to start talking about Hanuman giving the Kashera next. Well, that's what the tradition states, that Sri Hanuman Sahib, who's not a joke, who's one of the most loyal Bhagats ever, that even in Guru Granth Sahib, he's praised. His Bhakti to Ram is praised. His loyalty is praised to his Murshid, to his Guru. If in our tradition they say he gave the Kashera, why is that a big deal? It shows that Guru Gobind Singh was so high that even Hanuman had to come and give a gift for Khalsa. It doesn't make us less, it makes us more. And that's what I think, what we've done with Sikhi is we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Anything that's remotely related to India, Islam, anything like that, throw out the bathwater. What we're gonna stop doing part because we've got words Oankar, Satanam. Satanam comes from Kabir Panthis, Oankar comes from Rig Ved. We're going to stop doing part because we're afraid of Hinduism. We've gone absolutely mental. We've actually ruined our Panth and we've made it into McDonald's bite-sized information snippets for dibby, idiotic, lazy people. You should never do that with scholarism. Keep it at the highest level and it will filter down. Never change your history to suit the idiotic. Otherwise, in the end, you become an idiot yourself.
No, fair. So just to clarify on those two then, Gobind Geeta and Hanuman Natak aren't from the pen of Guru Gobind Singh Ji.
Hanuman Natak is not from the pen of Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj, but he gave it his approval to be read as a liturgical text. Gobind Geeta is definitely from the pen of Guru Gobind Singh, but it's a chapter within the works of the Mahabharat of the Kavis.
Oh, okay. So actually the Gobind Geeta is part of a larger text, which itself isn't written by like Guru Gobind Singh Ji. So Gobind Geeta is, but the rest of it isn't. Okay, I see what you mean. All right, fair.
That's right.
So
it doesn't have a context to be in Dasam Granth Sahib.
Yes, and actually taking it out on its own is removing it from the wider text it was actually part of as well then.
Exactly. And look at what the Bhagavad Gita is. It's not about Biras per se. It's about what is Yog, what is What is the truth? What is bhakti? So it's, in the last podcast, we talked about the major theme of Dasam Granth is righteous war, dharamyud, to fight for what is noble, and the tactics of that, what that involves, the rudras, the fear of the battlefield, the bloody dread of the battlefield. To imagine that before you get there is a good training. So that's what Dasam Granth is Udanaki, who was this? Trump. Trump said, Dasam Granth is very bloody, and that's really derogatory language. But if we take away the derogatory language, what he means is there's a lot of blood and guts in there, and it's true. Look at the part in Chandi Charitra, Pare Jogani Pattar Jo Sacharang, the witches are drinking out skulls on the battlefield, drinking blood out of the skulls of the dead fallen warriors. So there is all this Bani, which is really fearful and stuff. So then you see the Gobind Geeta contextually doesn't really fit in with Dasam Granth. And then somebody will say, well, Shabad Azare doesn't. But what I've mentioned is that's there to cool down and give you a break in all that biras. It's positioned there to give a break to the reader of that thing. And then in a way, it's like, like when you have a movie and you're watching a movie and there's a scene that's completely unrelated and it focuses on some kid smiling or some random object somewhere, and you get a little break, then it goes back to the main narrative. It's a clever form of the writer to take your attention away from that story. And also, like if you look at something like the Mahabharata, you have a story within a story within a story. The narrator does that and then comes back to the main story. Guru Gobind Singh was a master of literature. He also did the same. So of course you're going to have Kirtan in Shabad Azare. Of course you're going to have different compositions to take you out of the main narrative temporarily. But Gobind Geeta is a very large work. So to have that, it's like almost turning over to a completely different film. It doesn't fit in. And so that's how I see it. And that's only in one manuscript, which is Patana Sahib. And that has Ugurdanti and other Baniya. And so other people will say, well, because then what about Ugurdanti? But, we've explained that. It's a smaller Bani. It's in Biras. Namo Ugurdanti and Anti Savaya is talking about the fearsome teeth, the Shastra of God. It's talking about Akal Purkh as the primal Shastra. So it fits in with something like Shastra Namala. It fits in with something like Chandi Divar. It fits in with other Baniya within Dasam Granth and that same Biras, that same kind of like apocalyptic idea of destruction and renewal, which is obviously probably important ethos for any warrior to have. They're not just fighting to kill, they're fighting to renew. It's a more powerful idea, isn't it? If I'm saying you're fighting just to murder and fighting to kill, to be a barbarian, it's not going to really rouse any sane person to want to fight. But if I give you the idea, you're fighting to renew, you're fighting to build, you're going to be shaheed to put a foundation for something more noble. Isn't that more inspiring? And that's what people miss in Dasam Granth Sahib. And that's because people don't have the tools. They don't want to study like Rupert Snell's book on Brij Pasha, which is readily available. They don't want to study Chris Shackle's book on Gurmukhi. You can find all these. You can buy them. And so you have to look at the language. We're divorced from the language. And I know myself, like in my Oxford book with Gurinder, we translated the apocrypha for the first time and put it all out there. And we included the original Gurmukhi in terms of transliteration using the ISO, what we call Romanized version. And we did that so people can connect to the Gurmukhi, to the Ras, to the spirit of that Bani. We didn't make the translation so we can all be lazy and sit on our asses and not understand anything. And I'm not saying that, oh, I'm really great and I understand it. So, look, there's so many Nahang Singhs in India, and it was my supervisor, Dr. David Cheatham. He really put me in my place a lot of times. And he said, you know a lot about this subject. He goes, but you imagine a Nahang Singh who's lived in Nadal for 30 years and he's ritually read Dasam Granth cover to cover for like 1,000 times or 2,000 times. He goes, you can't compare. And that made me realize the level of vidya that the average Nahang Singh who lives that life has compared to me. because I'm going to go through it once, twice, 10 times, 15 times. You imagine a Singh or Mahapurush who's been through it thousands of times. And so the Dasam Granth is giving us a certain spirit, Biras. And Biras is not opposed to Naam. Yeah? Is not opposed to Naam. And this is what's different. Guru Gobind Singh Maharaj, when he finalized the Khalsa Panth, he did not want to create a passive religion. He didn't want to create a violent religion, which is based on Hinsa. He created a non-violent religion that was armed and had a warrior ethos. It's a very clever idea, Sant Sipahi. Somebody who doesn't want to harm anyone, but will always defend. And somebody who's in the spirit of being tiyar, bartiyar, always in readiness. And that's why these Baniya were removed, because they did not want us to be in a spirit of readiness.
No, definitely. So you've touched upon some of the other Baniya that were removed by the Sodhak Committee, and there were a few that I just wanted to ask you about. So obviously you mentioned Ugurdanti. So that I'd like obviously you to explain a little bit more about that. You also mentioned Sansar Sukhmana, which would be interesting to hear more about, and then also Indra Kavach, because I've never actually heard of that one before.
Yeah, because the Indra Kavach again is just in one or two sarups that I've seen. I saw it. It's in the Patana Sarup mentioned in the contents page, and then it was in a very old anthology. When I mean very old, I mean like 1718 or something like that. I can't remember the date exactly, but very early on in Sikh history of the newly formed Panth. So it would be important. And in there, that's a kind of a mantra of healing. So when Indra was cursed by Gautam Rishi, in the Sakhi of this is in Guru Granth Sahib, he was cursed to be covered in vaginas. And I think his Sakhi is also in the Charitar Upakyan. And it was the Indra Kavach that removed the curse of having those vaginas all over his body. So it means like to remove like negative energy from the body to allow health. We're talking about this idea that sound and vibration heals. And not only sound and vibration heals, sound and vibration can motivate a person to war. That can rouse somebody to the level where they're motivated to war. And, that's a big thing. So, when we look at the apocrypha, so we mentioned Lucky Jungle Khalsa, that sang in Geeta, and that's been removed. So that's where in Rag Maj, of Majja. And that is when Guru Gobind Singh goes and sees the Khalsa and Guru Gobind Singh meet again after all these battles. So again, Khalsa worldview. Look at the name, Lucky Jungle Khalsa. So again, something related to the Khalsa, removed. We talked about Nishani Sikhi, about the Panj Harf Kaf, that's removed. Then we've got Var Malkonski, prophetic, removed. We've got Siri Bhagoti Stotra, it talks about Shahidi in there, removed. Ugurdanti, talking about Khalsa, Blue Pesa, positioning our worldview in between that of the Indian Hindu worldview and Islamic worldview as a third path, removed. Sansar Sukhmana doing kind of the same, removed. Rag Asa, Rag Sur, removed, doing the same. As for Kabit that does the same, removed. Does that make sense? There's a common theme there, and I think that we should look at some of these compositions in a bit more detail, like particularly if we look at Chandi Charitar, Ukt Balas, Chandi Charitar, Chandi Divar, and then the removed apocryphal composition Var Siri Bhagoti Ji Ki Pashai Dasmi. And again, it is very apocalyptic, and it talks about, Kar Sutta Singh Jagaya. So, the sleeping lion has been awakened. So Singh is mentioned in there. Then it talks about the Bhagoti. Then it talks about, the slaying of corpses and bodies on the battlefield, and cannons and blood and guts, and Dharambaraj is shaking about it, and this conflict in the world is being overcome. And Guru Gobind Singh's name is mentioned in there. Fateh Jang Gobind Singh. So it's removed. So we've got Guru Gobind Singh talking about himself in first person being removed. And some scholars who I spoke to, they said this composition was said to a Brahmin. And it was a Brahmin who tried to flee from the sacrificial fire at Naina Devi. So there's that whole, Durga, episode. Yes, it is probably related to that. So, and then we go into Varmal Konski Pashai Dasmi, and I've already repeated this idea of Harji Harmandar Avenge is the line that's repeated. And this bit about the blue horse, Jab Nila Kora Nila Jora, Pakkar Khanda, Kufar Hai Tora. So this line, about this blue horse and annihilating the false and so on. This again comes and people have also said that Guru Gobind Singh never wrote in Guru Nanak's name, but in here we have Nanak Uha Naam Ti Aaya Nanak Jo Prapavenge Harji Harmandar Avenge. So you have this composition that's removed, which is highly prophetic, highly biras. And it was said that it was chanted before battle. So this is what I've heard about it in the Buddha, that this was chanted in Varmal Gons before battle. And that's something that's disappeared. I also heard from Baba Hanuman Singh from Gravesend, Mahakal, from Baba Sahib Singh Kalatari's time, who was the last Akali Nahang Singh Jathadar of the Akal Takht Sahib, that he remembered Gobind Geeta part being done in the Dal. So I went through all this with Baba Hanuman Singh, and he remembered all these Baniya. So it was important for me in terms of praxis. And you probably know he was like over 100 and something when he died. He was ancient, He's famous all over England as the oldest Mahakal Nahang Singh. So I was lucky. I went to see him and interview him and ask him about these things. So, that was really important for me. And then, we've got Bhagavati Stotra that features in Krishna Avatar as Siri Sahib Ji Ki Ustad. So, we say in about the Siri Sahib in the Ardas, don't we? In the modern Ardas. And here, Siri Sahib Ji Ki Ustad. So this is where Guru Gobind Singh is explicitly calling the Bhagavati what we call it, but Siri Sahib. That's what we say, Siri Sahib, don't we? You hear anyone, they say Siri Sahib. Even the Hangs call it Siri Sahib to the Bhagavati, to the Karpan. So Guru Gobind Singh is calling it Siri Sahib himself. Siri Sahib Ji Ki Ustad, the Bhagavati Stotra. And in the Bhagavati Stotra, the line which always kind of makes me kind of understand what it kind of is alluding to is about how if you die, what you get. What is the outcome of dying shahidi? Jabe mein ante bir to ko sharke parle kaal ke sind bakke karke. But basically, when the warriors get martyred in the battlefield, then they go to Swarg, they go to the heaven with jubilation. That's the shahidi. And Maharaj again alludes to the same again. Bir samhe siddh savant pure. So they go to the pure lands when they get shaheed, which is a kind of a Buddhist idea about the pure lands. But what it means there is that in Surya Prakash by Kavi Santokh Singh, what it means is that they overcome Maya to the level that they have that physical power to even manifest that will. So this is alluded to in here. And then it says, look at this. Can't we see why this is removed? Mahapoop Hawe Uttare Rajpave. Those people who wield the weapon of Bhagavati, they win the kingdoms and heavenly worlds. Of course, they don't want anyone to repeat this. And again, we have Guru Gobind Singh's name. Guru Shah Gobind Ki Rakh Kijay at the end of the Bani. And, Bhagavati Stotra, I don't really need to go over because we mentioned about the Sakal Jagat Mo Khalsa Pant Gajje, Jage Tarm Hinduk Turk Dand Pajje. I mean, it's all self-explanatory. I don't even need to explain it. It's very clear what's in here about the Khalsa and about the position of the Khalsa in between the Hindu and the Islamic world. And then how does the Ugurdanti finish? Again, we have Guru Gobind Singh's name. And that is the signature of these pieces. They say Guru Gobind Singh couldn't sign with his own name. Eight Siri Gobind Singh Virachite Siri Bhagavati Shan Kastamang Samapatang Sat Sabang Sat. So they say Guru Gobind Singh couldn't have written his own name there. Why couldn't Guru Gobind Singh sign his own name? What was the problem? So they make all these kind of ideas and they say, well, it can't be because of this. Well, who said that? Who said it? And then Sansar Sukhmana is more about Bhakti. It's like a Thandi Bani. But you get the same kind of things about what Kaljug is, what Sach is, what Jhoot is, and about loyalty to the Guru, about Prem Bhakti is very Thandi, it's complementary. And, about Vaheguru Mantra. And, it's one of the Baniya where Vaheguru is talking about how to do Vaheguru Simran. How we do Vaheguru Simran now is mentioned in that Bani about using the breath, what each syllable of Vaheguru means. I mean, come on, surely it must be important that we read it. And again, talking about what Hindu is, about what Musliman is, and about what the power of Hari is. Har ki karni, just like, you've got the bodies in Sukhmana, very complementary, talking about what a Sekh is, talking about what conflict is, what is in Kaljug, to repeat the name of Har. But again, it's got sections in it that are Birasi, again, complementary. Again, the same kind of, the leitmotifs we've talked about previously in other compositions. And so, and then I think the real eye-openers for me were like Rag, Asan, Rag, Surat, where you have about the Pan Singhs, the 5 warriors, the saintly brothers who wear their kamar kasse, who give their heads to the Guru, because it's time to give the head, because there is a battle on the earth against the demons. I mean, this is all really self-explanatory. The command to keep Gish so that you glisten like the sword. My name is the Guru adorned with the hair, I will call my army. Hamaro naam Guru ke stari, hum apni sain balaye rahe. And talking again about the Chayo Kamar Kase. Nanak Gobind ek kar dekho. Hum tija majab chalayo re. So the third path again. Talking about what Ek Onkar is. And then talking about what it is to be a warrior, what it is like to be a Rajput, a Kshatri. And then, how we have in the Khalsa Panth about the horses, doing horses seva. What is the last line in this composition of Rag Surat Pashai Dasmi? Kore Das Gobind Singh ki Bhagati Dadani Pong. The horses of the slave Gobind Singh are his devoted charity. I mean, these are really clear lines. And then you got the Asfortak Kabit Savaye. I mean, why? There's so many old Sarups that the Sodhak Committee use, which has the Asfortak Kabit Savaye in them. And they've removed it. It just makes no sense. And why? Because of its relation to Shastra Vidya. So I think, that's a good overview. And I think it opens more cans of worms than it answers, but that's my position on all of it. And people might look at it and say, well, you just blindly believe in all of it. You've not looked at it critically. No, I've looked at it and assessed it critically from the beginning to the end. I didn't just believe in it because, I decided to become a Nahang Singh, and then it was, the Nahangs believe in it, so I believe in it. No, I had a proper methodology looking at the stemma, lamata, transmission of manuscripts, how these different versions came in chronologically, what the themes were of these different Baniya, why they're excised, what the reason was, how, the fact that the leitmotif in them is biras, warfare, sacrifice, shahidi, khalsa. So it's not a simplistic view at all. It's a very refined view, and people who have read through Sikh history and have read through Dasam Granth Sahib and Guru Granth Sahib Sarblo Granth Rayatnam mein and other Sikh literature, they'll understand my position really well.
Thank you. Even with the last one, the response has been phenomenal. And I think the thing is that there's a lot of want to know what happened, is happening, and the consequences of that. But it's also getting the information from the people who have done the work. And obviously, I'm very fortunate to know yourself and like known you for some time, which obviously helps as well in kind of having these conversations. And I think, in a nutshell, that's really helpful because even for myself, a lot of the stuff that we've spoken about is new to me. And now I'm going to go away and dig out books and dig out and stuff and actually get into them and read them and try and figure out a little bit more so that I can quiz you some more. But interesting nonetheless. I think even just the context and the clarification about Gobind, Geeta and Hanuman Natak is really interesting for me because I've heard about them since, I don't know, for quite a while, but then to know actually what their context is, how they fit in, and the rest of it is definitely useful.
Amar Singh, can I just butt in? I just want to say something on not a scholaristic level, but something on my mind on a practical level. So obviously we've got metaphysical understanding, and we've got scholaristic understanding of literature and Maryada and stuff like that. And that's all fine and dandy. But my message to anybody listening to this from myself, Book of Five Rings, I believe is called, from Japan. It talks about what a warrior is, what a samurai is. It's somebody who lives in nature. Because when you live in nature, your senses become heightened. How the hell are you going to fight a battle if you're in front of PlayStation playing games? How the hell are you going to pick up a sword and even have the reflex action to defend yourself if you don't train with the sword? So for me, ultimately, Mara says in Chaupai Sahab, and the line slips my mind, Je puja asket ki nit prit kare banai. If you actually want to do the puja of the sword, of the Lord of the Sword banner, of the Siddhi Sahib, then you must practice its use every day. So for me, Dasam Granth and this whole Bani is actually saying to us, make a connection with weapons. I mean, like Shastra Namala, Askirpan, Kando, Karak, Tupuk, Tabarati, Sefsrui Seti, Yehe Hamare Peer. That's why we place Shastra in front of Guru Granth Sahib in the Prakash. It's symbolic, but it's also telling us these are our peer. And if you pick up a Shastra in your hands and you move it around, they reveal to you their usage just by the momentum that they make. When you pick up a bow and an arrow, you don't have to be Albert Einstein to figure out how it works. They teach you themselves to a certain level. And yeah, having an Astad helps. Having a teacher in the art of weaponry helps. And so the thing for me, what I'd say to people is, yeah, if you do Dasam Grantha Path, that's all really, really nice. And that's really beautiful. And it's going to really rouse your morale and your spirit and give you bravado and chardikala and heightened optimism and everything like that. But yeah, if you're not picking up a weapon at the end of that, then you're just abundant.
Touche. And I think on that note, that's probably a good place to end it. No, but as always, no, thank you for your time. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for obviously sharing the information that you've got. I think you're right that this has opened up more questions than answers, but that's what I like about this, because then hopefully people listening to it will be naturally inclined to go and do some of their own research. And just off the feedback of the last podcast we did, I'm pretty sure it will be very similar with this one. So no, thank you once again.
No, thanks a lot. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to share my research, and yeah, I'm happy to share, and yeah, thanks for giving me a voice.